everyone. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Gilded Age, which is the first section of our study for this semester. The Gilded Age got its name from Mark Twain. Something that is gilded looks really bright and shiny on the outside, but is rather corroded and rusty on the inside. And he's going to give this time period that name because on outside appearances, it looks like everything is going on really well in the United States. We are, putting our country back together from the Civil War. Our industries are growing. People are moving around. New people are coming into the country. And so to outsiders, it looks like it's doing really, really well. But if you just scratch under the surface just a little bit, you're going to find that there is a lot of problems and a lot of corruption that's going on underneath the surface. One of the good things that is going on during this time period, though, is the advent of all kinds of new kinds of inventions. And people are starting to process things in a more efficient manner. I'm going to share some pictures with you. So, in the country, you have a assembly line system where things can be processed by them moving on a conveyor, and all you do is stand there and do whatever you need to that part, and then it moves on down the line. And so if you've ever watched the TV show How It's Made or Factory Made, then you may have seen how fast some of these factory systems can work. But they're also going to employ a lot of children and young people. And so you can see in some of these pictures that, these boys are probably 9, 10, 11 years old. This young lady right here may be 10. And so it's going to require a lot of labor force, which is going to include a lot of child labor. Now, this is all based off of something called economies of scale. Economies of scale is the more things you make, the cheaper it is to make it. And so this mass production is going to create a lot of items, but at the same time, it's going to be able to produce them at a cheaper rate and therefore be able to offer them at a lower price where more people can buy them. Some of the new inventions that are going to, and processes that are going to come along, are going to have to do with industries that are going to develop. We have oil that's going to be found in Titusville, Pennsylvania, in this time period. And so this particular oil field up here, that's in Pennsylvania. It's going to be just a little bit before they strike oil in Texas with Spindletop, but that is on the horizon as well. Oil is going to change a lot of things. It's going to go from gas lighting or from candle lighting to kerosene lighting and gas lighting. And so more and more people are going to be able to have lighting for longer periods of time. The sewing machine is going to be something that is going to come on the scene where you can now have the ability to buy clothing off the rack that is already made instead of having to buy bulk cloth and be able to, just cut it out and sew it by hand yourself. The Bessemer process, where they learn how to make steel instead of just using pig iron or cast iron. The Bessemer process is going to make huge difference in things because now we can make steel that is going to allow us to build buildings skyward. And that's why tall buildings are called skyscrapers, because to the people back in this time period, they didn't realize that buildings could get that tall. Most buildings before this time were only about, maybe 4 stories high, because that's the maximum amount of weight that the wood could withstand by building that high. With steel, you can build them as high as you want. I think the World Trade Center, before it was attacked, was 110 stories, if I'm not mistaken. So with steel, that's going to cause America to move upward. It's also going to allow us to lay steel rails for the railroad. It's also going to cause things to be able to build stronger, like bridges and things like that. The telephone. Alexander Graham Bell is going to get credit for the telephone because he beats the other guy that had the same idea to the patent office by about 2 hours. And so that's why Alexander Graham Bell gets credit for the telephone. But that's going to allow us to have mass communication. Now, the telephone back in the day didn't work the same way it works today. Most people were on something called a party line. And so there would be several households on one phone line, and so it rang in everybody's house, and you could pick up and listen to somebody else's conversation. So telephones were really in the new stages, and so it had a lot of glitches in it. Now, this little symbol up here, that's the light bulb. Now, Thomas Edison is going to figure out how to get the filament to work inside the light bulb and cause the vacuum. And with the fluorescent, with the incandescent light bulb, now they're going to be able to have light at the flip of a switch that they never had before. They're now going to be able to run factories 24/7. They've never been able to do that before. And so the electric light bulb and Thomas Edison is going to make a huge difference. He was probably the main inventor of the day. He believed in inventing, several small things every year, and then every so often have a really big thing. And so he is going to be really into creating electricity and new inventions and stuff like that. Now, the railroad is going to expand exponentially during this time. I mean, we had trains over here on the eastern side of the United States, especially in the Northeast, prior to the Civil War. Trains start becoming a thing in the 1840s. But after the Civil War, they are going to lay track as if they had no tomorrow. And the Transcontinental Railroad is going to meet in Promontory Point, Utah, and join the East and the West. Now, this is going to benefit the United States in a lot of different ways. Number one, it's going to give us a national market. So you can gather up natural resources on the West Coast. You can train them across to the factories on the East Coast. They can manufacture them into goods, and then you can train them back to your customer base that is all over the country. And so it's going to give us this national market. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad was started on one end. It was the Union Pacific on one side and the Central Pacific on the other side. And when they join them together, it's going to be a big celebration thing, and they're going to have a gold spike and a silver spike and 2 iron spikes and join these rails together. Of course, now they don't leave the silver and the gold spike in there, but it's a huge picture of everybody standing in front with it. For the first time, they have joined the country east and west by rail. Now, another thing that is going to be beneficial is because they're using steel rails, now they can standardize the gauge. And that means the width between the rails. Because before this time, if you were shipping something from Chicago all the way over here to New York, they might have to offload and reload your cargo as many as 6 times because the rail widths were different for different rail lines. And so by having a standard gauge, you can now load your stuff up in Chicago and train it all the way over to New York. Because every time they had to offload it and reload it, that made the price go up because you had to pay those people to do that. So by streamlining it, it's going to cut cost. But they're also going to create time zones because now you have to have a schedule so that you know when something's going to arrive or when to be there to put your things on the train. And so if you'll look at this map, you'll see all these little blue lines. Those are the time zones across the country. So this over here, this is the Eastern time zone. Here you have the Central time zone. That's the one we're in. The Mountain time zone and the Pacific time zone, and it just keeps on going. It's based off of the Prime Meridian and Greenwich Mean Time, which goes through Greenwich, England. And so that's Prime Meridian is 0 up and down, just like the equator is 0 side to side. Okay, and so the time zones go this direction or that direction, and so we are an hour behind the East Coast. So right now it is, say it's 12 o'clock right now in Dallas, Texas. So that would mean that it's 1 o'clock in New York City, or it is 11 o'clock in Santa Fe, or in Los Angeles, it would be 10 o'clock. So if you've ever watched the Olympics and you've seen where it says GMT -7, well, GMT stands for Greenwich Mean Time, and we are 7 hours behind Greenwich Mean Time. So I say it's noon in Texas, then it is 7 p.m. in London, England, because Greenwich is right there in London. And so that's what that means. And so with the time zones, you can schedule your train route so that you know when trains arrive and when trains leave. But of course, it's also going to lead to the first monopolies. And this is called stock watering. It starts off with inflating the weight of livestock by pumping them with water. And it makes them heavier. If they're heavier on the scales, then you can get more money for them. But you can also stock water when you overinflate the price of stocks. And so this is going to be one of the first areas that corruption is going to hit American industry during this time period. So in 1887, Congress is going to pass the Interstate Commerce Act that is going to create a commission that will regulate the railroads and keep them more in line and allowing fair rates to everybody and not just their favorites. So you also now have the rise of big business. On this next slide here are what you would call captains of industry. These are the big money makers of the time period. Some of these men are rags to riches stories too. Andrew Carnegie was a very poor immigrant from Scotland. John D. Rockefeller, his dad walked out on them when he was a teenager and stole every dime they had, even what he had saved up in his piggy bank. And so these two men especially brought themselves up from nothing to be very rich and powerful men. J.P. Morgan here, he comes from a banking family, so he grew up wealthy. It was called the House of Morgan. And so some of these guys are in railroads, some are in steel, some are in oil, some are in the automobile industry, and they're going to be called captains of industry if you liked them. If you didn't like them, you called them robber barons. But it was exactly the same people. So if you'll notice in your notes, I had kind of listed the characteristics depending on if you liked them or not. So if you thought they served the nation, they increased supply, expanded markets, created jobs, donated to the public good, then you would think they were great guys. They're captains of industry. But if you thought that they stole from the public, had laws made in their favor, overworked their employees, were ruthless toward their competition, then you would call them robber barons. But they are the exact same people. Now, two of the ones that I really want to talk about the most are Andrew Carnegie, or Andrew Carnegie, it just depends on how you want to pronounce it, and John D. Rockefeller. And that they each used a different business model. So Andrew Carnegie used a vertical integration. That meant that he owned everything from the mining company taking it out of the ground to the retailer selling it to the public and all the things in between. He owned the entire process, and that's vertical integration. And for John D. Rockefeller, he did horizontal integration. He owned Standard Oil Company, but he had the controlling interest in everything that fed into his company. So the rail lines, the banking, the shipping, everything that fed into his company, he owned the majority stock in those companies, so he had control without actually owning the companies. Now, Carnegie Steel Carnegie, after a time, will get tired of all of the ins and outs of running this business and some other tragedies that happen along the way. I'll get to that when we start talking about some of the strikes. And so eventually he will sell Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan will change the name of it to U.S. Steel. And it will become the first billion-dollar corporation in the United States. It is still an ongoing corporation today. It is considered blue chip stock, and so it's still around today. J.P. Morgan gets, he gets his start in banking, but he will be brought in to regulate the railroads as well as the banks. He is very good at this. That's because his dad taught him from a very young age how to manage money, how to make more money with money that he already had, and those types of business tactics. Cornelius Vanderbilt is in shipping and railroad, and then Jay Gould was in railroads and finance as well. Now, these are the top names when you're talking about the big industry names during this time period. Now, a lot of the success of these guys is going to be built off the backs of the workers. So I'm going to share this cartoon with you. These are your millionaires of the time period. So you've got Vanderbilt up here, Jay Gould's up here, a few of the others. And if you'll notice all this under here, you see all these workers who are propping them up. Basically saying that the rich are being made that way off the labor of the working masses. And because of where this cartoon is situated is towards the water, they're also indicating that a lot of these workers are immigrants that have come to this country. And so it's not portraying the millionaires in a favorable light. As you're looking at political cartoons, because you're going to see a lot of them this semester, a political cartoon is an opinion that is expressed in a drawing. They are not usually meant to be funny. Sometimes they are if you agree with the point of view. You can find them, amusing. But most of the time, they're trying to get across a political point. And so what they're saying here is that these robber barons are cheating the system. Now, a lot of this is based off of something called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism was based off of the theory of Charles Darwin of the survival of the fittest, which means that the strong will survive and the weak will be weeded out. And that's going to be applied across business and across society. So strong businesses survive, the weak businesses should fall by the wayside, and they really wanted the government to stay out of controlling business and corporations. It should rely only on supply and demand. This is known as laissez-faire economics, where that's French for let it do, and the government doesn't have a whole lot of regulation on what's going on in corporations. They're also going to use the scientific theory of management, and that is going to be a time analysis study done by Frederick Taylor. He's going to go into these factories with a stopwatch, and he's going to time how long it takes to do all these different tasks. And it's going to create these very formal, tight-running factories based off the clock. And so, therefore, the worker is going to just become another cog in the wheel. There's going to be this total separation between management and the worker, and the workers are going to become just fodder for the machine. And you're going to wind up with a lot of what you have are the haves and the have-nots. So I've given you a picture here in this next slide. So the haves would live in luxury, and the have-nots would live in squalor, because that was all that was available. Now, one of the earliest business reforms is going to be the Sherman Antitrust Act that they're going to pass in 1890, trying to control the monopolies that have been created at this point. So the Sherman Antitrust Act prohibits combinations or monopolies in restraint of trade. And so they're trying to keep these big corporations that were inhibiting competition and running out the little guy from having so much power. But they didn't put any kind of enforcement into it. And so what's going to happen is that it's really going to hurt the unions instead of busting up the monopolies. So you're going to have workers that are going to come together and form unions, trying to get corporations to look at their needs and be more responsible to their employees. So one of the first ones is the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor were first headed by a guy named Terence Powderly. And this particular union took in everybody. They took in skilled, unskilled, men, women, all different minorities. And so they welcomed everybody. The other one of huge note is the American Federation of Labor, this one over here. It was formed by a guy named Samuel Gompers, but it only took in skilled craftsmen. So it was a craft union. So that would mean that it only had white males in it. Another one would be the American Railroad Union that was headed by Eugene V. Debs, and this one was for railroad workers. And then you have the International Workers of the World, the IWW, and they were a more of a socialistic type of labor union. Their nickname was the Wobblies, and so I could remember this one because of a toy that was popular when I was a kid that just came out again here just a few years ago, and they were called Weebles, and Weebles were about this big, and they had a little rounded bottom, and you couldn't knock them over, so the commercial were Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down, and for some reason that's how I can always remember the Wobblies. But the main thing that all these labor unions want is better pay, better hours, and safer working conditions. I mean, and if you look at how these factories run, they can be very, very dangerous to work in. Let me go back up to this picture up here that I showed you at the very first, and look at these guys. I mean, these are children. This guy here is in his bare feet, and they're working in this fast-moving machinery. Children were used a lot to unjam the machines because they were small and they were nimble and they could get up in there. But they would come back with missing fingers or arms. Sometimes they would fall in and get killed. And so that was one of the dangers. But some of the boys worked in the coal mines, and they would suffer from the same things that the men would suffer from working in the coal mines, and that's called black lung. They didn't have masks to wear and breathing apparatus, and so they would breathe in the coal dust, and it would stick to the linings of their lungs and cause something along the lines of emphysema. The same thing would happen to these little girls right here, because this is thread, and it spins really, really fast, and it creates what's known as thread dust. And so they would get what they call white lung, because it would stick on the, as they breathe it in, stick to their lungs and cause something along the lines of emphysema. In England, some of the little girls worked in something called the match factories, and their job was to put the striking end onto the match. So that's that little yellow tip that's on the top of a match. And back in this day, they used phosphorus. They don't use phosphorus anymore. But phosphorus is caustic to bone. And as they did this day after day, the phosphorus would start eating away at the bone structure in their face. And it would cause what was known as phasejaw, where their faces would sag because they would not have any bone structure. They would eventually die because it would move back and eat the bone structure in their neck as well. So the conditions in these factories and in the mines were very unhealthy, and so that's why the workers were trying to get better conditions. Well, the management wasn't listening very well, and so there is going to be a series of strikes that are going to happen during this time period. The first one that's mentioned in your notes is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The B&O Railroad, that is the Baltimore and Ohio. Yes, it's the same one that shows up on the Monopoly board. And it has cut workers' wages for the second time by 10% again. So that means they've 20% over the two cuts. And so they're being made to work longer hours for less money. And so they're going to go on strike. And it's going to turn ugly. And they're going to wind up setting about $5 million in property on fire. The management can't get it under control. They're going to call in help from the federal government. They're going to send troops, and that's going to break it up. The next one is the Haymarket riot in Haymarket Square in Chicago. It's just a big open area, and they, the Knights of Labor were having a rally, having a march. Well, some anarchists get into this, and a bomb gets thrown into the mix, and a bunch of police officers get killed. Well, yeah, they're going to arrest the anarchists, but they're going to arrest a lot of these Knights of Labor, and Knights of Labor are going to get blamed for all this, although they had nothing to do with the bombs going off. And so it's going to make unions look really, really bad. And so that doesn't help any. By the time we get to 1892, Andrew Carnegie has gone to Scotland for a vacation. And he has left his second in command, Henry Frick, in charge of Carnegie Steel. And Andrew Frick he's ruthless. He is an actual, when you think robber baron, think of Henry Frick, because he is ruthless. And he is going to not listen to the workers. He's going to ramp up production. He is going to use a lockout to prevent strikes. So he's going to lock any kind of workers that don't want to work. He's going to lock them out. And so they're going to go on strike. And the big Homestead strike is going to turn really ugly. Because Frick is going to call in the Pinkertons, which was a detective agency back during this time period. Today, I think it's an armor car company. But back in the 1800s, it was a detective agency. And a shooting match is going to break out, and a bunch of workers are going to get killed, and it's going to make Carnegie look horrible. They're finally going to bring in military protection. But people are going to start associating unions with violence. And you may not understand this at this point, but most people don't like violence. I mean, we like to watch it from a distance. If it's happening over there, that's why we go to boxing matches. That's why in high schools, kids will crowd around to watch fight. But if it starts spilling over onto you, you back up. And so if there's a fear of getting hurt, then people will stay away from it. And so people are going to start staying away from unions. The last big one I want to talk about is the Pullman strike. Now, Pullman cars are those very fancy train cars. If you have seen the movie Murder on the Orient Express, or if you have seen Wild Wild West with Will Smith, those really fancy train cars that look like they're little living rooms inside the train car, that's a Pullman car. So they come with a whole staff of a butler and a bartender and a maitre d' and all these kinds of things. And so Pullman, not only did they hire workers, they also gave them living quarters at the time was a reasonable rent. But times got tough. Pullman's going to reduce workers' wages by 25%, but not reduce the rent. And so it's really going to be a double whammy for these workers. And so they're going to go out on strike. They're going to call in the ARU and ask them for help. And it's going to get ugly. And President Cleveland, who is president at the time, Grover Cleveland, he is going to send in troops, and a court order is going to stop this particular strike. And so union gains are not going to happen for the next 30 years. They're going to decline in membership over the next 30 years because of all of the violence that has gone on with workers trying to get attention as far as hours and pay and working conditions. Now, you also have got a reform movement going on, trying to clean some of this up. Some of your earliest reformers are going to be your purity crusaders. These are ones that are going to go against immoral behavior, prostitution, gambling, all those different kinds of things. And so they're trying. It's called vice, and so they're trying to clean up society. And this right here is Anthony Comstock. And so it's going to be one of the first laws that's going to prohibit obscene or porn type of literature being sent through the mail and stuff like that. Now this guy over here, this is Charles Sheldon. He writes a book called In His Steps. And it's basically a book about what would Jesus do. And walking the walk instead of just talking the talk. And so these are going to be some of the ones who are going to start the process of trying to fix some of the ills of society. Now, another thing that's going on, so we talked about the rise of cities and the rise of industry and inventions, but you've also got people that are going to be headed west. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the availability of transportation now. You can ride the train west or get on a stagecoach and go west, and it's a lot faster and a lot safer. But there's also things that are going to attract people to go west. So there's something called push and pull factors. Push factors are things that make people want to leave. So the overcrowded cities, the corruption, the too many jobs, too many workers and not enough jobs. So that's going to be things that are going to push people away. And then pull factors are going to be things that are going to attract people to come that way. So one of the first things that's going to attract people is cheap land. In 1862, Congress is going to pass the Homestead Act, which is going to offer 160 acres on the Great Plains for about $30. And all you have to do is live on it for 5 years and improve it in some fashion. So building a soddy on it like that would improve it. Now, this is also a soddy. Yes, that's a cow up there on top. If you were lucky and you built your soddy against the hillside, then that gave you one wall that was made out of dirt instead of what the soddies were normally made out of. Soddies are made out of bricks that are clay or dirt and hay or prairie grass and cow manure. So because cow patties are flat. And so they're going to use those for building materials. They're going to use them for fuel. And yes, your sod house is going to smell. But they had to do it this way because there were no trees on the Great Plains. When you crossed the Mississippi River at this time, all you saw for as far as you could look from horizon to horizon was prairie grass. And prairie grass is very long rooted. It is wind resistant and drought resistant. And that is important to remember. But they could use this to mix it with the dirt and make these bricks to build their houses out of. And that's why they're called soddies, because they were made out of sod. And yes, they come with all of the wonderful critters that come with houses made out of dirt. So yes, you're going to have mice and fleas and bugs and all those kinds of things. But that's what you had. You could tell when someone had done well as a farmer because they could afford to have lumber shipped out from the east to be able to build a frame house. But there are going to be people still in the 1930s that are living in these soddies out on the Great Plains. Now, the soil out there is pretty nasty. You don't get a lot of rain. It's not always a real fertile soil. And so they're going to use a system known as dry farming technique. And they're going to start plowing up all of this prairie grass and planting wheat and corn were the two big things. They also will plant hay and soybeans and field peas and stuff like that. But mostly it was wheat and corn. And this is going to be a place where they're going to be in competition with other groups, like the Native Americans, as well as the cowboys that will come along here in a minute. In 1889, you're going to have the Oklahoma land rush, where you get the nickname Boomer Sooners. The boomers were the ones who waited for the cannon to go off and went out and staked their claim for whatever land they wanted. The Sooners were the ones that snuck in early and got the best land. And so that's where the Boomer Sooner thing comes from. But that's where they're going to start giving away the land that they had given to the Native Americans back in, the 1830s for as long as the rivers ran and the sun shone and the wind blew. If you've ever heard the term Indian giver, it comes from the American government giving things to the Native Americans and taking them back whenever they found something they wanted there. So if someone's an Indian giver, they had given you something and they're taking it back. So you have these cash crops, and you're going to have a one-crop economy. And overproduction is going to cause crop prices to drop. And so workers are going to get together because their bills are still their bills, and the banks still want their money on the mortgages. And so they're going to form these social clubs. The first one's called the Grange, and they're going to do at these social clubs like most men do. If they go hanging out with their buddies after work, they're going to sit around with a beer, and they're going to talk about their jobs and what their life is going on. And as time goes on, these social clubs are going to turn into farmers' alliances, and they're going to band together trying to get better railroad rates, better crop prices, a way to be able to keep more of their hard-earned money instead of it always flying out the window towards railroads and banks and stuff like that. And so that's the first group that's going to go west. Another group that's going to go west for opportunity is going to be pulled by job opportunities. You have something called the long drive. And so they're going to take longhorn cattle that are doing really well down in South Texas, and they're going to drive them northward to Kansas and Nebraska where the rail lines are, so that they can be put on trains and shipped to the slaughterhouses in Chicago. And it's important to remember that the slaughterhouses are in Chicago. That's why Chicago is known for its barbecue and known for its beef. The big slaughterhouses in the United States were in the Chicago area. And so they're going to ship them up there or drive them up there and put them on the trains to take them to the slaughterhouses. But right now, at the beginning, they're going to have what's known as the open range. So cowboys can just herd up all the cattle and just move them north. Now, there is a lot of misconception on cowboys, and that is because of Hollywood. If you think your first image, you think about cowboys, your very first image is going to be a tall white guy with a Stetson hat, cowboy boots. Some of you girls may think that they're really attractive, and that type of thing, but that's because that's what Hollywood has trained us to think. Only a third of the cowboys were white. Another third were Hispanic, and the other third were black. So this picture right here, that's Nat Love. He was the most famous of the black cowboys. But the Hispanic cowboys, they're the reason why cowboys wear the big brim hats and wear bandanas to keep the dirt out of their face and have chaps. All that come from the vaqueros that were the Mexican cowboys. And no, girls, they were not sexy at all. These people, these men, lived with their animals for 3 months at a time as they were driving. They didn't park the animals out there and then go into town and get a hotel room and get a bath and shave. They probably didn't take a bath unless they fell into the creek for the whole 3 months. And they chewed tobacco. So they weren't exactly what the Hollywood image would like for us to think that they were. Now, one of your most well-known trails is going to be the Chisholm Trail that goes from South Texas straight through Fort Worth and on north. So that's why you have the Chisholm Trail tollway over in Fort Worth. That's why you have the stockyards over there. And that's why the nickname for Fort Worth is Cowtown, because it was a major cattle center during this time period. And then you also have got the miners. Now, men are going to go west looking to find riches, and they're going to start in the 1840s and carry on all the way. Well, you still have people searching for gold. If you watch the TV show Gold Rush, there's still people trying to find gold in Alaska and gold in the Bering Sea and all over the place. And so the miners are going to go west, and one of the first big loads is going to be right here. It's the Comstock lode. It's just east of San Francisco, and that's why San Francisco becomes a boom town, because they find gold in their hills, and they find the Comstock lode in 1849. That's why the football team is called the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, just like Pittsburgh is the center for Carnegie Steel and the steel industry, and that's why that football team is known as the Pittsburgh Steelers. And so you have all these men that are going to go west trying to find their fortune in gold. Very few of them do. Most of if they find any gold at all, they find just enough to be able to feed themselves from one day to the next, because they're not really going to ever become really rich. So a lot of the traffic starting off is going this way. They're going to California. But in the 1870s, they find gold up in the Klondikes, way up here in Alaska. And so they're going to start heading this direction, and you're going to have the Alaska gold rush, the Klondike gold rush, in the 1870s. The benefit to finding all this gold is going to stabilize the United States Treasury and allow us to go back to using specie instead of fiat money. So specie is gold and silver. It's hard money. Fiat money is paper currency, and it's based off of whatever value the government says it has. Okay, so being able to find all this gold is going to allow the government to resume using specie instead of fiat money. Now, in all this travel back and forth, we have got a whole group of people that have already been living there for thousands of years, and that's the Native Americans. And just like anybody else, they're not going to be happy about this white man coming in and hedging them over out of their territory. So you have to make sure that you keep your tribes sorted. You have got your tribes from when white men first come back in the colonial times. You have your tribes that are involved in the Indian removal policy and the Trail of Tears, and then you have your Plains Indians. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Plains Indians. Your major tribes, you have the Lakota, or the Ocala Lakota. I have in your notes Sioux written in parentheses. They don't much care to be called the Sioux. That was French for snake in the grass. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be wanting to call a snake in the grass. So they are the Ocala Lakota. And their two major chiefs are going to be Sitting Bull, that's this guy here, and then Crazy Horse, and that's this guy here. If you have ever been to Mount Rushmore, you may have gone around the 17-mile circle and seen where they're carving a mountain into Crazy Horse. And so that was the Lakota tribe. The Nez Perce were led by this guy right here. This is Chief Joseph. He is the one that's famous for the line, "I will fight no more forever." He almost had his whole tribe over into Canada before the U.S. Army captured them and threw them onto a reservation. I don't know why they just didn't let them go. I mean, it's appalling. But they're going to bring them back and throw them onto a reservation. This guy right here, this is Quanah Parker. He is a Comanche. He is half white. His mother, Cynthia Parker, her family had a fort over by Mahia, Texas. It's over in East Texas. And it got attacked by the Comanche. And Cynthia and her sister are kidnapped. And she grows up with the Comanche. And she meets Quanah's father, and they marry. And so Quanah Parker is the last of the big Comanche chiefs. And then this guy right here is Geronimo, and he is Apache. I don't really know why they yell Geronimo when you jump off of things, but it was named after him. Now, there are going to be several Indian battles during this time period, and this is when you're going to go from having an Indian nation that covers all of the territory west of the Mississippi to just little spotted reservations in certain parts of Western America. So the first one is the Sand Creek Massacre, and it happens in 1864. So this is still while the Civil War is going on. I'm going to share the next screen so you can see some of the different tribes. And Colonel Shivington and his troops are going to ambush a tribe and slaughter 400 unarmed Indians and just wipe them out. The next one is the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1874. Now this one is led by a guy named George Custer. He was a famous Civil War Union hero, but he had some really obnoxious views about Native Americans. He believed, he would say, nits make lice. and nits are what they call lice eggs. And so he meant that if you are going to go after a tribe, an Indian group, you need to kill every last man, woman, and child, or they're going to grow up to be big Indians. And so I don't have a whole lot of sympathy or admiration for George Custer. He is, the Battle of Little Bighorn is also known as Custer's Last Stand. He was very arrogant, and he thought that he and his 270 guys were going to be able to go in and wipe out this tribe, and that doesn't happen. He gets wiped out instead. I'm sorry. It couldn't happen to a nicer jerk. He was just very, very single-mindedly and very, he just wanted to do genocide on the Native Americans. And then the last Native American battle of note was the Battle of Wounded Knee. This one is where you're going to have the ghost dance being done, and that's what is in this picture here. They're doing the ghost dance, and this was a dance to ward away the evil people that are trying to attack them. And so the U.S. Army gets wind of this. They want to stop it, and so they're going to attack this tribe at Wounded Knee, and once again, it's going to be a slaughter. In the 1960s, the Native Americans are going to stage their big protest at Wounded Knee because that's where the last one happened. Now, what really, though, is going to get rid of or I guess defeat the Native Americans is going to be the railroad, because as they get the Transcontinental Railroad built, you're going to have European men come over and think it is a big sporting game to stick their rifles out the windows of trains like this one right here and see how many buffalo they can kill at one time. And so you're going to have bison that are just strewn all over the prairie, and all that all they've wanted off of these dead animals is their head for a trophy, or maybe their skins to sell as pelts. But the Native Americans used the buffalo for everything. Their bones were made into tools and weapons. Their skin was used for teepees and for clothing. Their sinew was made into rope. Their meat was used for food. And so when they destroy the buffalo, then they are pretty much going to destroy the Native Americans across the board. And so by the time you get to 1900s or 1890, the Native Americans who had all of the land now are all scattered on all these different reservations. Now, some of these reservations still exist. If you ever go to the Grand Canyon, I suggest going up on the eastern side of the Grand Canyon and go in on the eastern side towards the south rim, because there are Navajo tribes up there that sell their crafts and their goods in these little spots on the way in before you get into the Grand Canyon area. And so everything you buy from them goes directly back to their tribe. I'm a very firm believer in buying local and buying small business instead of big corporations, because I just think it benefits the people that most need the benefit. Now, moving on to politics in the Gilded Age, you have got a series of presidents that are basically not part of the no-name presidents. So we can go through them fairly quick because not a whole lot happened. There's a little bit for each one of them. What you really need to know is that during this time period, the rise of big business is what is going to control what happens in politics. And so with this cartoon right here, you can see that the sugar trust, the oil trust, the steel trust, all these guys back here are controlling the Senate on this one. So Ulysses S. Grant gets elected in 1860. I think that's the time frame. He is president for 2 terms. He was a great general. He was a horrible president. Because as a general, when you say jump, all your guys say when and how high. That's the way the military works. Not so much in government. And so he didn't keep a good watch over his subordinates, and they got up to all kinds of evil shenanigans. And so you have the credit mobilier scandal, which was the most notorious of his scandals, where railroad owners hired themselves at inflated prices, which is totally illegal. It's called getting a kickback, which is getting money under the table. After he leaves, Rutherford B. Hayes is going to become president, and he is going to, because of the Compromise of 1877, where he gets rid of Reconstruction, he is going to give up the Republican commitment to equality, because he's basically going to throw the freedmen of the former slaves of the South into whatever condition they're going to be subjected to in the South, as the Solid South comes back together at that point. James Garfield and Chester Arthur run together. So Garfield's president, Chester Arthur is vice president. And Congress is trying to do something about the spoil system. It has gotten totally out of hand. You have all these incompetent people in office. Nobody really knows what they're doing. And so you have a group that say, oh no, leave it alone. It's just fine. And those are going to be the stalwarts. And then you have those that want to keep it but think it needs to be fixed. Those are the half-breeds. And then you have the other ones that want to totally get rid of the spoil system, and that is going to be your independents. And keep in mind, the spoil system is also called patronage, okay? And so Garfield is a half-breed, and Chester Arthur is a stalwart, and they get elected. And one of the guys that votes for them has been hanging around Washington for decades trying to get a government job. No, he's nuts. And nobody wants to give him a job because he's just crazy. And so he's voted for Garfield and Arthur, and now he's expecting a government job, and he doesn't get one. And he's mad. Garfield gets off a train one day, and this man kills him. Well, Chester Arthur is so appalled that his president has been killed over this stupid spoil system that he is going to back the Pendleton Act, which gives us the civil service test. So if you want to get a job in the government, I don't care if it's postman or secretary or what have you, you have got to pass the civil service test. It's an aptitude test. It tests what you're good at, not what you know. Okay. And then in your notes, you'll notice that I have got Harrison Cleveland. Grover Cleveland is the only president to serve 2 terms, but not back to back. So you got Harrison in the middle of it. And during this 12-year time period, there are going to be tariff and economic issues. You've got Congress spending money like it's got it. There's one thing I need to stress to you, you'll hear me say this over the semester more than once, is that nothing is government funded. Everything is taxpayer funded. And if you don't have enough taxes coming in, you can't do diddly squat. Okay? But they have promised a pension to Civil War veterans, and so it's going to cause problems with that. Increased silver in circulation is going to cause inflation because you have easy money, too much money in circulation. The McKinley tariff is going to backfire, and it's going to devastate farmers in the United States. And so there's a lot of unintended consequences, things that they thought was going to be a good thing, and it wound up turning around and slapping them in the face. That's going to happen during the Cleveland time frame. And so you're going to have political machines that are going to rise up in different areas, especially New York City and New York State. And so this here is a political machine diagram. It's a cartoon about it. This is Boss Tweed. He was the most well-known of the political bosses. And he was over Tammany Hall, which was the most well-known and most controlling of all the political machines. It starts in the 1870s. It's still controlling New York State politics in the 1920s and 1930s. Okay. And so a political machine is an organization that's got a single boss, and it's going to control votes by controlling the people. So these immigrants that are going to start coming into the United States, they're going to do something nice for them. They're going to find them a place to live. They're going to help them get a job. And in return, they demand absolute loyalty. You vote the way they tell you to vote and when they tell you to vote, or they're going to, harm you if you don't, because they don't have the secret ballot at this time. So everybody knows how everybody is voting. Okay? And so the political machines can wield a lot of control in a lot of these major cities. If you owned a business, you paid them protection money, so they wouldn't come and beat you up. So you were paying them money to protect you from them. Okay? So that's some of the first part of what's going on during this time period. Now, the next lecture, I'll go on into some of the stuff that's going to happen as far as the Populist Party and stuff like that. Now, in your notes, you're going to see that I have got a prompt in there and 3 columns. It says, was the westward migration of Americans after 1865 brought about primarily by developments in transportation, economics, or government policy? If you want to help yourself and to know the information and be able to do well on the test or any kind of paper or what have you, quizzes that I come up with, then you're going to want to do these prompts. So what I would suggest is you find out, go back to your notes, find 2 developments in transportation, 2 in the economy, and 2 in government policy, and describe what they are. And then be able to see if, decide which one of those 3 columns were the most beneficial after 1865. Now we're talking about after the Civil War. So make sure you know what your time frame is and how these 3 columns tie into moving westward. Okay? So next week we'll pick up again with the rest of the Gilded Age. Until then, y'all have a great day. Thanks. Bye.